Welcome to The Critique, where today we are reviewing a comprehensive literary analysis of Delia Owens' Where the Crawdads Sing, examining its ecological themes, dual timeline structure, and the sociocultural controversies surrounding both the text and its author.
This is a remarkably well-researched submission with a lot of depth, so let's dive right in and look at how we can strengthen this material.
Definitely. So getting right into the feedback, where should we start today?
Synthesizing the author's biographical controversies directly into the thematic analysis of the novel will elevate this critique into a profound, Alfred Kazin-style exploration of moral landscapes.
Yeah, because right now, if we look closely at the section discussing the ethology of the marsh, alongside that author controversy, the submission handles these as, two entirely distinct, almost quarantined sections.
Right, they're just completely walled off from each other.
Exactly. On one side of the essay, we have this fantastic, really extensive breakdown of Kaya's biological observations in the novel. The writer points out her intense focus on the dishonest signals of female fireflies luring males to their death.
And the female praying mantis devouring her mate, yeah.
Right, and the writer does an excellent job of detailing how Kaya internalizes those natural behaviors as a framework for her own life. But then, on the entirely opposite side of the draft, usually separated by a hard section break, the material outlines the real-life 1995 Zambian incident.
Yeah, the anti-poaching patrol.
Exactly, led by the author and her husband, and then the televised shooting of the alleged poacher on that ABC documentary, the legal fallout. It reads like a separate historical appendix.
And that is exactly where this draft really trips itself up, through that strict compartmentalization. The weakness here is that by treating the real-life controversies and the text's biological justification for murder as two completely separate topics, the analysis treats the author's lived reality and her fictional text as parallel but completely separate phenomena.
They just don't touch.
Right, they don't touch. The writer is missing a massive opportunity here to interrogate how the author's personal worldview fundamentally engineers the morality of the novel itself. If we just leave the text in Chapter 1 and the biography in Chapter 2, the essay overlooks the profound ways they inform each other.
It really does read like two different essays stapled together at the moment. If I'm reading this critique, the moment I get to the 1995 Zambia incident, I want to see the connective tissue.
A much stronger approach would be to completely fuse these elements together. The suggestion here is for the writer to use the biographical context as the primary, overarching lens to analyze the novel's concept of natural justice.
Which leans right into that Alfred Kazin-style exploration you mentioned.
Exactly. Really looking at how a writer's personal lived social realities and underlying philosophies inevitably bleed into their fiction. Kazin was masterful at showing how the American mythos was shaped by the specific, often flawed realities of its authors. And that framework is perfectly applicable here for constructing the ethical universe of the text itself.
That framework makes so much sense for this specific book. The material already makes a strong case for the ecological justifications of violence by highlighting that Sneaky Fuckers article Kaya reads about evolutionary tactics. But we need to talk about the actual mechanics of how the writer can execute this fusion on the page.
Right. So for a concrete example, let's look at Kaya's murder of Chase Andrews. Instead of discussing that act solely as a clever plot twist or merely as a reflection of marsh ethology, the writer could use a transitional paragraph that frames this fictional murder as a direct manifestation of the author's real-life philosophies regarding survival.
Oh, I see. Arguing that, in the author's worldview, eliminating a perceived predator is morally justified.
Exactly. Whether that predator is an alleged poacher in the Zambian wilderness or an abusive ex-lover in a North Carolina swamp, it's biologically justified. It supersedes the laws of men. By putting the real-life ideology right next to the fictional action, the critique argues that the ending of the novel isn't just a twist, it's an ideological statement.
Building on that point, what if we apply that same fused lens to the racial and social dynamics present in both the biography and the novel? We can look at the characters of Jumpin and Mabel.
Yes, the only Black characters of significance in the book.
Right, and the current draft rightly points out that their depictions feel a bit flat. But we can take that further. The writer can connect these patronizing, stereotypical depictions directly back to the author's documented colonialist attitudes during her time in Africa.
That is exactly the kind of deep, probing connection the essay needs. The critique could show how the novel's entire nature girl fantasy relies heavily on historically comforting, two-dimensional archetypes.
Specifically, the magical Negro or the mammy figure.
Precisely. The author uses these archetypes to absorb and validate the white protagonist's suffering.
And by doing so, the author completely bypasses the actual, brutal realities of the segregated 1950s South. The black characters in the novel exist almost entirely outside the systemic oppression of Jim Crow.
They exist solely to nurture Kaya.
Exactly. If the writer points this out, they transition the essay from a standard book review into a sweeping critique of how literature can be used to launder personal ideologies and reshape historical realities to make them more comfortable.
It fundamentally changes the thesis of the essay. It moves it from, this book has some interesting biology and a controversial author to, this book is a biological justification for the author's worldview. It's incredibly compelling. And realizing that kind of thesis brings us directly to how the essay itself is physically built.
Which is a perfect segue.
Reorganizing the analysis around overarching thematic conflicts rather than the novel's chronological timelines will create a more cohesive, driving argument.
Yeah, because as I understand it from the notes, the argument right now is mapped directly onto the novel's own architecture. The draft perfectly mirrors the book's dual timeline structure.
It divides the critique squarely into two halves.
First, we have the developmental timeline, spanning from 1952 to 1969, which covers Kaya's abandonment, her isolation, and her coming of age. And then, the essay switches to the investigative timeline of 1969 to 1970, covering the discovery of Chase's body and the subsequent murder trial.
It is incredibly common for writers to do this when analyzing complex narratives. But the weakness here is that mimicking the novel's timeline actively fragments the critique. This structural choice causes the analysis of Kaya's internal character development to feel totally isolated from the analysis of the town's prejudice and the rigid legal system.
It's the classic plot summary trap.
Precisely. When you follow the timeline, it prevents your argument from building any real momentum. The submission starts to read much more like a sequential plot summary. First, this happened in the marsh, then this happened in the courtroom, rather than a cohesive literary argument.
It fundamentally dilutes the critical voice, because the writer is basically letting the novelist dictate the terms of the essay.
Exactly.
Okay, so what I really like about this part of the submission is the sheer depth of the research the writer has done on both of these timelines. The textual evidence is all there, and it's rock solid. But it clearly needs an entirely new framework to hold it all together so that the critical voice can actually shine.
The suggestion here is that a much stronger structural approach would be to tear down that timeline and rebuild the essay thematically. The writer should focus heavily on the friction between the natural world and human society.
Which aligns perfectly with that Kazin-esque focus on social realities versus individual isolation that we were just talking about.
Right. By organizing the material around thematic collisions rather than dates on a calendar, the critique will transition from a passive observation of the plot into an active, driving exploration of the text's core meaning.
Let's visualize how that thematic outline looks on the page with a concrete example. The writer could create a dedicated standalone section titled something like The Law of the Marsh versus the Law of Men.
Oh, I like that.
Right? And within this single section, they could discuss Kaya's childhood survival tactics, like bartering crocker sacks full of mussels with jumpin'.
Or physically hiding in the marsh grasses to evade the truant officers.
Yes. But instead of leaving that in the 1950s section, they pull it forward and place it directly alongside the courtroom scenes featuring Judge Sims and Tom Milton from 1970.
That juxtaposition is where the magic happens. By placing those specific elements next to each other, the writer can prove how the murder trial is the ultimate clash of two opposing legal systems.
It highlights the absolute incomprehensibility of formal societal structures.
With its gavels and tailored suits.
Exactly. Contrasting that to someone whose entire neurological wiring was forged by the estuary. It stops being about when things happened and starts being about why they matter.
Let's give another concrete example for this structural shift. Focusing on the character archetypes. Is the connection between the characters and the ecosystem fully established in the material right now?
Well, they are introduced chronologically. Tate appears when they are kids, Chase appears later.
But a great way to improve this would be to group the character analyses by their relationship to the environment. The writer can analyze Tate as the scholar or nurturer, side by side with Chase as the social predator.
By removing the chronological distance between them in the essay, the writer can highlight the stark contrast in how these two men interact with both Kaya and the marsh itself.
Right. Tate shares a profound reverence for the ecosystem. He brings her rare feathers, he teaches her to read the natural world scientifically.
He gives her language for what she already intuitively understands.
Meanwhile, Chase uses the marsh merely as a secretive, disposable playground. It's a place to exploit Kaya away from the prying eyes of his elite Barkley Cove society.
Writing it this way forces the reader of the critique to actually engage with the concepts. You are essentially demanding that the reader look at Tate and Chase not as boyfriends in a timeline, but as avatars for different human approaches to the natural world.
This thematic grouping makes the comparative analysis so much sharper.
And it naturally sets up a much more sophisticated discussion about the world building itself. Because if the writer restructures this thematically around nature versus society, they're inevitably going to hit a wall with how the author writes the society characters. And I notice the submission actually brings this up, but it gets a bit bogged down.
Elevating the stylistic complaints about regional inaccuracies and dialectic into a formal social-linguistic critique will significantly strengthen the material's authoritative literary tone.
So a key theme running through this material seems to be a real palpable frustration with the author's world building, particularly regarding the setting and the dialogue. The submission makes excellent, highly specific points about geographical errors.
Like pointing out how the author mixes up the mountainous terrain of Asheville with the coastal Outer Banks.
Or describes cotton plantations situated in the mountains where the climate and topography make that agricultural setup historically and physically impossible.
The research on the regional realities is genuinely impressive.
It is. The draft also calls out the highly problematic use of Southern dialect. However, the tone used in these specific sections reads as somewhat exasperated and very casual. The writer uses highly colloquial phrases, calling the descriptive passages a snooze fest, and dismissing the dialogue as classist nonsense.
We've all been there, right?
Totally. You're reading a book for an analytical essay, you hit a glaring geographical error that you know is wrong, and you just want to rant about it in your draft.
It is incredibly tempting, but the weakness here is exactly that colloquial, frustrated tone. While the writer's frustrations with the text's inaccuracies are entirely valid, using a ranting tone undermines their own deep expertise.
It heavily detracts from the otherwise scholarly approach.
Right. The objective approach required for high-level literary criticism. When the critique slips into casual mockery, it loses its academic weight. It risks alienating a reader who is looking for a thoughtful deconstruction of the text's mechanics rather than a list of grievances.
You have to take a breath and turn that rant into analysis. It can be really jarring for a reader to go from a highly rigorous breakdown of evolutionary biology to a paragraph calling the dialogue a snooze fest.
A much stronger move, and the suggestion for this section, is to reframe these valid frustrations as a sophisticated academic critique. The writer should look at how the author uses language and geography to construct a sanitized, highly artificial fantasy of the South.
Instead of just venting about the errors.
Or expressing annoyance at the lack of research, yes. The writer needs to interrogate why those specific errors exist in the first place and what they reveal about the author's underlying agenda.
Let's talk about the dialect specifically. For a concrete example, instead of just mocking the dialogue as a hick stereotype, the writer can analyze how Owens weaponizes proper English as a marker of moral purity. It's a fascinating sociolinguistic mechanism.
The writer can point out the classist implications of how the good characters, like Kaya and Tate, magically lose their regional accents.
Right. Without any real outside influence or formal schooling or exposure to broader society, they suddenly start reciting poetry with perfect, unaccented diction.
Their linguistic purity is meant to signal their spiritual purity. And conversely, heavy, caricatured I dialect is aggressively used to mark other characters as villains or uneducated stereotypes, or simply the lesser citizens of Barkley Cove.
I dialect has a long history in literature as a tool of marginalization.
Exactly. If the writer pivots from saying, this dialogue is annoying, classist nonsense, to the author utilizes I dialect to systematically marginalize the working class characters while linguistically elevating her feral protagonist, the whole essay is going to sound vastly more authoritative.
That takes the exact same observation and just applies a sharper, more academic vocabulary to it. And we can do the exact same thing for a concrete example regarding the geography. Let's look at the historical and topographical inaccuracies, like putting a Piedmont hotel right on the coast.
Or flattening out the Appalachian Mountains to accommodate a plantation.
Yes, the writer shouldn't just frame these as poor research or a lack of basic fact-checking.
Frame it as deliberate evidence that the setting is an idealized, disconnected nature girl utopia.
The writer can argue that the author willingly bends the reality of North Carolina's geography to fit her narrative needs.
It proves she is far more interested in constructing an ecological mythology than she is in rendering a realistic social portraiture of the historical South.
She needs the setting to serve Kaya's isolation, so she literally moves mountains to make it happen.
That elevation in tone completely transforms a grievance into a profound literary insight. It takes all of the writer's deep, personal knowledge of the actual region and applies it as a critical scalpel to the text. It changes the conversation from what the author got wrong to what the author was trying to build. And that is the hallmark of top-tier criticism. It really is. The level of expertise and the depth of the research in the submission are truly impressive. The raw material here is incredibly strong, and I am very excited to see where the writer takes this. By shifting the structural framework and elevating the academic tone, this piece is going to evolve into a truly masterful work of literary criticism. I highly encourage the writer to keep pushing these boundaries.
To briefly recap our main actionable takeaways for this submission. First, integrate the author's biographical controversies directly with the text. Use a Kazin-style approach to explore how the author's real-life worldview provides the moral justifications for violence and race within the novel itself. Second, abandon the chronological timeline of the book. Restructure the critique thematically around the clash between nature and society to build a much more driving, cohesive argument.
And finally, elevate that casual tone regarding dialect and geography. Turn those valid frustrations into a formal sociolinguistic argument about class, purity, and the intentional artificiality of the novel's setting.
We warmly invite the listener to implement these suggestions, reshape the material, and submit the revised work back in for another critique. Until next time.